We're a bit more generous with our time. Today, I'm going to keep everyone identical or straight to their time. If you run out, will cut you off. If you don't leave time for the minister to answer, I will cut him off as well. So if you just watch your clocks. Minister, the floor is yours. Again, welcome to OGGO. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Merci. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the members of the committee for the invitation. I'm pleased to be here. As the Minister of Public Services and Procurement Canada, it's an honor to be here. So would like to thank the committee for giving me the opportunity today to discuss Canada Post, which is an essential institution for our country. It is an institution that Canadians love, and they are very attached to it, as am I. I think it's important that we have this discussion together.
Their valuable report entitled Canada's Postal Service, a lifeline for rural and remote communities. As Minister of Government Transformation, Public Works and Procurement, I welcome the work of this committee, and our government is committed to addressing their thoughtful recommendations. On Monday, October 20th, 2025, the government tabled its response to the committee's report, and I'd be pleased to discuss it later today. Mr. Chair, we are equally committed to seeing Canada Post survive through this existential crisis it is in, and I continue, as you all know, the labor dispute is ongoing. I continue to urge both management and the union to find a path forward at the bargaining table. I've met over the course of the last weeks and months with both the union and management, and I know that they're both committed to finding a sustainable path for Canada Post, and I urge them to keep negotiating in good faith. Because Canada Post is an institution that needs saving, and at this junction in its history, and maybe more than ever, it's an institution that needs saving. Depuis maintenant près de 160 ans, et encore à ce jour,
160 years now, the workers of Canada Post have connected Canadians in good and bad times, in small villages and big cities, often offering a life saver to these communities. Since 2018, Canada has accumulated about $5 billion in losses. In 2024 alone, it lost over $1.3 billion. And in January of this year, they required a $1 billion injection to keep the corporation operational.
The corporation lost $407 million, which is their worst quarter ever. And at this point, the corporation is losing $10 million every day. In fact, with the with the labor unrest that it is currently facing, it's probably more than $10 million a day at this point. The fact of the matter is, Mr. Chair, that Canada Post is effectively insolvent. Et quand on regarde l'évolution du monde, il ne faut pas s'en surprendre. Le monde
and when we look at the evolution of the world, it's not surprising. We've seen a decrease in letter mail, which has gone from $5.5 billion, or rather 14. While they delivered to 14.3 million addresses in the past, today it's only 17.6, so it's gone.
Billion letters per year. Today, that number is 2 billion. And 20 years ago, Canada Post delivered to 14.3 million addresses. Today, that number is 17.6 million. While Canada Post delivers fewer letters to more addresses, Canadians have been sending and receiving more packages than ever before, but they are increasingly turning towards private competitors. Monsieur le Président, Post Canada fournit
Mr. Chairman, Canada Post provides an essential service to Canadians and in particular to rural, remote and Indigenous communities. And Canadians rightfully want it saved. However, ongoing bailouts from the federal government to maintain the status quo is not the solution.
Given the current financial situation of Canada Post, the status quo and repeated bailouts by the federal government are not the solution. As a minister responsible, I must ensure that the overall direction of Canada Post aligns with the government's policies and objectives, and that implies making responsible, but at times difficult, decisions. This is why in September, I announced that the Government of Canada would accept the recommendations from the Industrial Inquiry Commission, led by William Kaplan. This means making a series of changes to stabilize the financial situation at Canada Post, including flexibilities in delivery standards. Le ménage moyen au Canada ne reçoit plus que 2 lettres par semaine.
The average household now receives just 2 letters per week, yet operations are still designed for much higher volumes. Adjusting delivery standards will allow non-urgent mail to travel by ground instead of air, and will save more than $20 million a year to the corporation. This government has also removed the moratorium on the conversion to community mailboxes. 3/4 of Canadians already receive mail through community, apartment, or rural mailboxes, while 1/4 still receive door-to-door delivery. I've authorized Canada Post to introduce community mailboxes to approximately 4 million more addresses, which will ultimately save the corporation nearly $400 million per year.
We'll be lifting the rural moratorium imposed in 1994. The moratorium has not evolved in 30 years, but Canada has changed. Areas that used to be rural may now be suburban or even urban. It also means that multiple post offices operating near each other, including some just a few hundred meters apart, are required to stay open. I've instructed Canada Post to come back with a plan within 45 days of the announcement to protect service in rural, remote, and Indigenous communities. And let me be clear. Canada Post has an obligation to serve all Canadians in every community in Canada, and that will not change. And I'm almost done. I'll speak at my pace in question period, so I'll try to be a little faster. At last, the government is reviewing the process for increases to the stamp rate to modernize and shorten it in line with the Kaplan recommendations. Taken together, these measures will help stabilize Canada Post's financial situation by generating close to $500 million in savings per year. But there's more to do, and as such, I've also asked Canada Post to come back to me within 45 days with a plan on how they'll be taking immediate action to address its financial challenges, which means finding efficiencies, reducing costs, reducing overhead, and reviewing and lightening its management structure. Monsieur le Président, en conclusion, notre gouvernement...
Mr. Chair, in conclusion, there are choices that we need to make, and if we don't do anything, that's a $10 million in losses every day. Inaction is not an option. These are necessary changes to save Canada Post and put it on a sustainable footing, and that is what we are committing to do. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. I forgot to welcome back Ms. Rejla and Mr. Rassi. I'm pronouncing your name wrong. I realize you've only been with us 40 times before. We're going to start our 6-minute round with Mr. Patzer. Go ahead, please, sir.
Thank you very much, Minister, for being here. I'm just wondering, did you have a chance to ever read and go over the 2017 report by this very committee?
Thank you very much for the question. There's been numerous reports on Canada Post and its future, so I've looked at many of them. I wouldn't say necessarily with the same detail that perhaps members of this committee have, but I did look at all the reports, and I will highlight that in the Kaplan report on which we base the changes that we've announced on September 25th, the Commissioner has looked at all the reports, and in fact there is one part of the Kaplan report which is titled Studied to Death. I mean, the future of Canada Post has been studied over and over again, and by this committee, which I thank for the work, but also by other institutions and organizations over the years, and that has informed the decisions that we made to move forward with the transformation of Canada Post.
Okay, so recommendation number 1 from the 2017 report is Canada Post be maintained as a universal public service for all Canadians and conduct its operations on a self-sustaining financial basis while ensuring that profits generated are reinvested within the corporation. What went so wrong?
I think I've touched on it in my remarks, and you know what we see with Canada Post, we see across the world with different postal services where the volume of letter mail has declined substantially over the years. 5.5 billion 20 years ago to 2.2 billion, and what has been, I'd say the anchor for Canada Post is that it's got a monopoly on delivering letter mail. It's been the way that Canada Post has attained profitability over many years. However, as we've seen the decline in letter mail volume, as well as the rising number in addresses where it needs to be delivered, I think that accounts for what went wrong, to answer your question. But I would also add, and it's highlighted in the Kaplan report, that the organization has become too big for the volume that it needs to deliver, and it's been constrained.
Okay, sorry, I'm going to
Yes,
cut you off there just because, as you know, we only have limited time. Recommendation 15, that Canada Post continue investing in the growth of its parcel e-commerce services which provide needed infrastructure for Canadian businesses. You did highlight that Canadians are largely choosing other providers for parcels, and I'll note that one of them is even owned by Canada Post. So how on earth could Canada Post not figure it out when one of their own subsidiaries is a profitable money-making company, and yet they can't even take that as a model and implement it for their own to be able to make money? Why is it like why is, when there's been so many recommendations, so many studies, so many reports, and I think a big emphasis has been on parcels and identifying that would be a path forward for them, and yet nothing's been done to address that for 10 years. Why is that?
I would suggest we are moving forward. The Kaplan report highlights some of what you've just mentioned, and in order for Canada Post to be competitive in the parcel business, it needs to be more agile, more flexible, and there are some things on which we as a government can do, and by that I mean lifting the rural moratorium, lifting the moratorium on community mailboxes, which is what we're doing, changing the delivery standard, which we are doing, changing the way we increase the stamp rate in this country. But there are things on which we don't have power, and that would be the collective agreements, and that has to be achieved at the bargaining table. And I'm hoping that both parties, given the dire financial situation that Canada Post is in, will find an agreement by virtue of which Canada Post will be able to be competitive going forward in the parcel business, and reach a path towards financial sustainability.
Well, I mean, why wait until they're in the middle of job action? I mean, it's gotten to the point, it's gotten so bad. It's not like this year and last year was the first years that they were losing hundreds of millions of dollars, right? I mean, it was pretty evident for even like years before COVID even hit. It was evident that this was the pathway that this was going down. So why was it delayed up until this point when it's the middle of a job action, and at a point where you even admitted in your opening remarks that as a company they're basically insolvent? So why wait so long to actually implement a plan on the future of Canada Post? Why?
Well, I think when you look at the evolution, if you look back at, for instance, when the moratorium was imposed on the implementation of community mailboxes 10 years ago, the financial situation of Canada Post was not the same. Hindsight, it probably should have gone forward. I agree with you on this. And however, I would argue that given that for the first time the federal government had to invest or inject $1 billion just to keep the lights on at Canada Post, and that in the foreseeable future the government will, at the pace at which it's losing money right now, we would, without any changes, would be in repeated bailouts. I think that warranted change and beginning the transformation of Canada Post, which is what we're doing, and I'm proud that we're taking that responsible decision.
So what political considerations went into you guys not implementing the plan until the 11th hour?
Listen, I've been minister for not even 6 months now, but
You've been an MP for 10 years, though. You've been in the government for the duration of the time.
I think when you look at the evolution, which is what I've highlighted, where in 2024, for this year, we've had to inject $1 billion, where Canada Post just had this summer its worst quarter in history. I think it warranted the changes to transform Canada Post, and I think Canadians are generally on board with the changes we've announced.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. Gasparo, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you for coming, Minister. I'm a little taken aback by some of the economics here in your presentation. $5 billion in losses, a burn rate of $10 million per day, probably accelerating more quickly than that because of job action, as you pointed out. Do you think it's possible for Canada Post to get on a path of financial viability?
I think it is. It's not going to be easy, and it will take some time. But that's why I've tasked the corporation to come back with a plan to right-size itself, to take a look at its overhead, find ways to find efficiencies and how it's managed, but also asking both the union and management to negotiate in light of the financial situation Canada Post is in, I think there is a way. And just the changes that we've announced on September 25th, in term, would generate savings close to $500 million a year. I think that goes a long way in the initial transformation to reach financial viability for Canada Post. But there is definitely more work to do. But I think the first step to stop the bleeding, so to speak, were to go forward with these recommendations from the Industrial Inquiry Commission, which we've announced on September 25th.
Thank you. So, and maybe we can just drill down a little bit. What do you feel are the key priorities to ensuring that Canada Post is financially stable and provides quality service to all Canadians, regardless of their postal code?
Well, I think as part of that, lifting the constraints that it's been operating under is really the first step. And when you look at, for instance, the rural moratorium, and I'll note that in reports from this committee, it was often highlighted that this needed to be updated. It will allow for Canada Post to look at ways to be more efficient. This moratorium was implemented in 1994, hasn't changed one iota in the last 30 years. And as I've highlighted, some of the rural post office that are included in the moratorium, which might have been rural 30 years ago, are now by any stretch of the imagination, suburban, in some instances urban. I was given an example in BC where on the plot of land where a post office sits, where it's covered under the moratorium, hundreds of housing units could be built, but nothing can be done because the moratorium is in place. So lifting it will allow this flexibility, and it will allow Canada Post to right-size itself, given the changing nature of the letter mail business. And, Canada Post is not alone in this situation. If you look at the situation in the US and France and Denmark, they were stopping letter mail service altogether for the most part, except in certain instances on islands. But I think that the change that we're announcing is the initial step that is definitely needed to stop the bleeding, because $10 million a day, I think, by any stretch of the imagination, is not reasonable, is not acceptable to Canadians, and I think lifting these constraints will allow for the corporation to find ways to right-size itself.
And there's definitely, obviously, a global shift going on in the parcel business, and the stats you laid out make it very clear, and this isn't unique to Canada. Having said that, I've heard from my constituents in Eglinton Lawrence who are worried about the transition to community mailboxes, especially for seniors and people with mobility issues. Are there accommodations in place for Canadians who won't be able to access their community mailboxes?
That's a very pertinent question, and to that effect, just in my own writing,
Might as well say the writing, because it's all part of the
my own beautiful writing of Louis Hébert, the best writing in the country, in all impartiality.
I may have to call a point of order on that, Mr. Chair.
No, denied. But honestly, in my own writing, 77% of my constituents still receive door-to-door delivery. So, the community mailboxes will, impact my constituents. However, when you look at the broader picture in Canada, 77% of Canadians already receive mail through community or rural mailboxes or in apartment buildings. That said, and I've made it clear to Canada Post that as they move with this transition to community mailboxes, they absolutely need to make sure that the communities which will transition need to be informed of the accommodation program in place for Canadians with mobility issues, because there is a program that exists. I think it needs to be well advertised. It needs to be known by all those who might require it, and if it needs to be enhanced, then it should be enhanced. So I'll be monitoring closely how Canada Post operates this transition, because it's important for all Canadians to have access to their mail.
That's our time. Thanks very much. Madame Gaudreau, please, for 6 minutes.
Bienvenue.
Welcome. to OGGO, Minister. In fact, this is an opportunity that we have, that you have to answer various citizens and workers' questions. If I start with the rural situation and vitality in the regions, what is the plan? Obviously, we're going to have an answer that says we're already starting this, but for people who are very worried today when they're told that the moratorium's been lifted. Well, thank you for the question. It's an excellent one, Ms. Gaudreau. When we say we're lifting the moratorium, that can raise concerns for people. And I want to be very clear in the directions I gave to Canada Post, which is to protect the service to rural and remote and Indigenous communities. That's fundamental, and I expect that that principle will be respected in the plan they put forward. In terms of the moratorium, the one that hasn't changed since 1994 has created situations that are hard to understand. And I could give you a list, but in some communities, I'm thinking of Richmond Hill, which isn't necessarily rural today. Perhaps it was 30 years ago. But there are post offices that are covered by the moratorium and that might have other service points, sometimes just across the street. So raising or lifting the moratorium will indeed allow a reasonable level of service to exist across the country, where there's not necessarily that sort of anomaly, while preserving services to rural communities. I had good discussions with the Union of Municipalities in Quebec on this subject because I understand the concerns. Often the post office is an essential link in many communities, and I'm well aware of that. It's really not what we're targeting with the moratorium. Well, Mr. Chairman, you have to understand, and Minister as well, that there's been a study done and it's going to be implemented across the board. And from the 25th of September, we weren't expecting that there would be such a lifting. So people should have been consulted, whether it's the people who live in vulnerable situations or when it's people who are saying, okay, I'm thinking of Francine in Mont-Roland. She's retiring in 5 years. There are other post offices that are nearby, but am I going to lose my job? What do we say to these people? So you must have some idea today. Well, as I said, it's really an effort to target post offices that are more in the suburbs, that are not really rural and remote. And in terms of jobs, the idea, and this comes really from the operational perspective of Canada Post, we'll have more information in the plan they put, but I think there are many postal workers who will be retiring in a few years and are worried. So part of that transformation will happen through attrition. I'm convinced of that. But I think that when we look and at consultations, there were many reports. A lot of work has been done at this committee. There was the Kaplan report, which is very extensive. And I think that all of the previous reports enlightened his work. The recommendations that he put forward at the end of his work, I think, are useful to begin this transformation. Because, in my opinion, once the corporation is losing $10 million a day and has just had its worst quarter, to tolerate the status quo even longer, I know that it's been the subject of exchanges between the two of us, because you said we're intervening in the midst of a conflict for these parties. But the transformation has to begin. Also, the negotiations have to happen in light of this financial situation of Canada Post. Okay, so the concerns of workers, I mean, what's going to happen if indeed we maintain the service for letter mail? And I'm thinking about municipalities that still use them. They really need that, but I'm thinking of remote regions, northern communities. Mr. Chairman, it took a whole story just for our witness last week to be able to send them the headset and microphone to. We had to delay her appearance because she couldn't receive it. So people are worried. They haven't had news since September 25th. So what is the surprise going to be in the next few days? Well, what I'm saying is the directive to Canada Post is very clear. They have to respect the service standard for delivery in rural. Well, it's an essential service for us. So, you know, the idea of moving forward with these changes is precisely because for us, Canada Post is an institution that is vital to this country and perhaps even more important to Canada than in other countries. And in Quebec, given the vastness of the territory and given that we have communities because of geography are farther than others, they need those services. For me, I wanted to ensure that we could save Canada Post and keep a good level of service to those communities. And that is the goal of the changes that we are trying to make.
5-minute rounds, and Mrs. Block, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I'm going to cede my time to Mr. Boularice.
Certainly. Mr. Boularice, welcome back to OGGO. Floor is yours for 5 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome,
wow.
Minister.
We're giving the NDP some time?
I'm
Why?
disappointed and sad as well. A few years ago, you were against cutting home delivery, and now you've changed your mind. So the direct result is going to be cutting service to 4 million people in Canada who will no longer have the right to the service they had before because you changed your mind. My first question is very simple. I represent Rosemont, Sainte-Patrie. It's a rural riding. You're going to impose community boxes on everyone there by cutting the service that people have been used to having for decades. So, simple question. In my riding, where are you going to put those community boxes? Thank you very much for the question. I'm very surprised to see this collaboration between the Conservatives and the NDP. So I salute you, Madam Block, for sharing your time, and I'm pleased to answer your question. First of all, what I'd say is that 77% of Canadians already receive their mail in community mailboxes, including in rural areas and in apartments. Secondly, when you say today you're in favor of something whereas 10 years ago you weren't, the reality is that 10 years ago, Canadians were receiving much more letter mail at home than they receive today. On average, a household in Quebec now receives 2 letters a week compared to 7 back then. Microphone, please. 7% is a percentage that is not quite reflective of the situation. You're counting apartment buildings. I'm talking about letter mail at home. But the specific question you're not answering, where are you going to put these community mailboxes in Rosemont, Patrie? Are you going to put them in schoolyards? Are you going to put them in studios? Are you going to rent spaces somewhere? Where are you going to put them? Well, I can't answer you for one specific community, but I know that they have transitioned to these mailboxes in communities for areas that formerly received their letter mail at home. So I think, as I mentioned earlier, in my own riding, a lot of people, the majority, are favorable given the change of reality. They're all right to receive their email in community in these boxes, these community mailboxes. Delivering mail to a home is $279 million a year compared to $157 for community mailboxes. So I think reasonable Canadians who are looking at the financial situation of Canada Post are saying that that's not too much to ask to go and get your mail in a community mailbox, given the financial reality. You're not answering the question. Are you going to rent spaces to put community mailboxes in Rosemont, La Petite Patrie? It's going to cost you something. So I don't see how the situation is better with the figures you just gave me now. I asked you a question. I only have 5 minutes, and I have one more question. The last year of profitability for Canada Post was 2017. You were in power then, and you let things fall apart since. So the financial situation is bad. But you're always talking about letter mail, but you don't talk about parcels. Canada Post formerly had 60% of that market, and now they only have 20%. You did nothing. So why did you let this happen, this death by 1,000 cuts? Well, there are several reasons that explain that, particularly the constraints under which Canada Post has to operate, particularly the fact that they have little flexibility for weekend deliveries, and to have that possibility when we know what Canadians are expecting. And we're not talking about just parcels. They want rapid delivery of everything. So I hope that the union and management will manage to agree on something that will make Canada Post much more competitive in terms of parcel delivery. What the union several people has suggested for years, and now the Liberal Party did nothing. Ms. Adam Strong, who is a professor at the University of Toronto, who said that an expansion of this postal service, as they did in Japan for many years, could have brought in extra revenue to Canada Post. And a poll that was done at a UN agency said that 84% of countries offer financial services through the post, and that's more revenue that could have helped Canada Post, and the Liberal Party did nothing for that either. So why do you obstinately refuse to offer a banking service that could have created more jobs?
Mr. Billeries, but perhaps on another round, or perhaps with Ms. Rochford. 5 minutes, please. Go ahead.
Oui, merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Puis,
thank you very much,
Holy
Mr.
crap,
Chairman.
lean into the mic more.
Nipissing Temiskaming, which is a rural urban riding to some extent. A number of citizens have mentioned to me how they find you to be an excellent communicator. And as a result of the manner in which you... yes, so and I actually personally think the same thing, and so I'd like to add that to that comment. And certainly, I think what I have found is that the citizens with whom I've spoken, and they basically understand the need for change. I think the communication has been in such a manner that people understand. Yet, I have many seniors and rural communities that want to make sure that there will be continued service and that there will be a Canada Post that moves forward. And so basically I've heard the term it's a vital organization, and no one puts that into dispute. And so the need for change is understood, and that it's a vital organization that needs to survive is equally very present, I find, in my community. At the same time, people appreciate that we're in a digital world that's changing very quickly. And so I'd like to hear your thoughts on how you view the role of Canada Post in the future, in this, I guess, in this digital economy in which we live.
Okay, so first off, I'd like to thank your constituents. Now I'm reassessing, and of course, my writing is, of course, the best, but I would argue yours is second best now. And you know, and it goes to answer the previous question from MP Boulris. In my mind, and it's in line with Commissioner Kaplan's report, if we are to talk about Canada Post's future and maybe how it can evolve in the next 10, 15, 20 years, it first has to be efficient at its primary mission, which is connecting Canadians, delivering mail, delivering parcels, and delivering services in rural, remote communities. But I think the work of this committee, and certainly will be useful in looking at, you know, what could be done with Canada Post over the next, in the long term. But I think in the short and medium term, it's important for us, if we are to be responsible, to stop the hemorrhage, stop the bleeding, given that Canada Post is currently losing $10 million a day, that it's, you know, it's reported its worst quarter in history in Q2 of this year. And I think Canada Post, Canadians are on board with this transformation. They realize that the world has changed. As you've mentioned, it's gone digital in the most, you know, at a pace, and COVID has accelerated that at such a fast pace that Canada Post needs to adapt. It cannot be stuck in a business model that was designed for the 90s. It needs to adapt to today's reality. So I think that, and just on one other thing you mentioned, Madame Rochefort, which is near and dear to my heart and is important for the government, for Canada Post, and for Canadians, is as we transition to community mailboxes, it's essential that Canadians with mobility issues still have access. And the accommodation program, which is maybe not as well known as it should be, has to be fully advertised so that all Canadians have access to a reliable postal service.
It's interesting because I was going to do a test in my community about the accommodation program in the months to come to understand exactly how it works, so I can convey it to the citizens who are in need of that service. But quickly, just maybe a few words on the impact that you see on business, the business community.
And when Canada Post, when the postal workers were on strike before Christmas of last year, I think you could definitely feel the impact on small businesses, and I think it goes to show how essential a service Canada Post provides, in particular to small businesses. To this point, I'll just reiterate what I've said many times, but I'm hoping that it doesn't fall into deaf ears, both for management and the union. We need to find an agreement. The sooner, the better. And finding an agreement between both parties will lift the uncertainty that has plagued Canada Post, plagued its revenues, and will offer the kind of certainty that small businesses need as they operate.
Thank you.
Jeez, stop leaning into the
I'll
mic,
leave it for
man.
Monsieur Boulris.
Holy smokes.
Madame Gaudreau for 2.5 minutes and perhaps the 30 seconds from Miss Rochefort.
I'd like to look a bit beyond the midterm. I imagine that you're aware of the German model for the post office, because in the 1990s they decided to let it be absorbed by DHL. But when I look at this, it makes me think of Canada Post and Purolator, and a lot of people are thinking about this. Are you ready to tell us today that you don't want to weaken Canada Post so that they end up being absorbed by Purolator? 100%. Canada Post has a very different mission than Purolator. They have the universal service model, the obligation to serve rural and remote communities, and indeed, through this announcement, we were often asked the question, why not privatize Canada Post? And I mean, to my thinking, it's impossible, it's unthinkable, given the essential service that it offers. We have to ensure that the corporation is on a financially sustainable and viable path, and that's why we announced the changes we did. Now, I think that in allowing more flexibility to Canada Post, particularly in terms of lifting these moratoriums, we'll see how it continues. But I hope that with that additional flexibility, with weekend delivery, for example, if the union and the management can agree on that, we'd have service that is not only essential, but also is competitive in terms of parcel delivery as well. So I think it's desirable for everyone. Well, I remain to be very concerned because the competition is fierce. And in fact, I wasn't aware of it before, but my predecessors here had said to me, how many studies have there been and so on, and now they say, but September 25th has arrived and we're talking about exponential growth. So when we talk about reducing the costs, if we all agree that this is an essential service, well, it's rather an issue of saying how are we going to deal with the competition, because if we can't get parcels through them, we're going to go through the business next door. Whereas if I have to drive for an hour, I mean, it's not going to be an hour, I understand, in most rural areas, but people want services quickly and efficiently. So how are we going to manage this? I would say that Canada Post's strength is its huge network. And so the weakness is the same thing, and we have to find a balance between the two.
Monsieur le Ministre. Les Canadiens comptent
Mr. Minister, Canadians count on Canada Post, not only for mail, but for daily life. Whether they're prescriptions or deliveries from small businesses come to our communities. And yet, for years, Canada Post has stated that its hands are tied by the rules imposed by the government. Why does this government act only now to save a system that for a long time has not functioned properly?
life. prescriptions, small business deliveries, and community connection. Yet, for years, Canada Post has had their hands tied by the very rules set by the government. So why is this government only acting now to save a system which was clearly not working for years?
D'abord, Madame Jensen, je vous,
First of all, Ms. Jensen, I take my hat off to you for your excellent question in French. That's admirable, and I greatly appreciate that. I would respond in saying two things. First, the reality has changed over the last 10 years. As I've already said, the letter mail volume has decreased. The financial situation of Canada Post has gotten worse. And I think that means that now more than ever, the changes we announced are important. They're justified and justifiable. And now I'd also say that following the election of April 28th, I'm part of a government, and I'm proud of that, that is wanting to take responsible decisions, sometimes difficult and courageous, to ensure the viability of Canada Post.
Okay, so you've been in the government for 10 years as an MP and as parliamentary secretary, and the problems at Canada Post didn't appear just yesterday. So why, I just don't understand, why just now sound the alarm? When Canadians are wondering if everyone at the table saw warning lights flashing, why did it take a decade for anyone in the cabinet to grab the wheel?
Yeah, well, on this, I'd say I'm as I've highlighted, the reality has changed over the last 10 years. And, you know, if you look back 10 years ago when the moratorium on community mailboxes was imposed, the volume of letter mail was not the same. The financial situation of Canada Post was not the same. And I think now more than ever, these changes are warranted to put the corporation on a more sustainable financial footing. And as I've mentioned, in hindsight, if you look back, I think these changes were warranted in many instances, and I think it's good that we're moving forward now. And I'm glad that I'm part of a government that's willing to make the difficult decisions, show political courage, and move forward with these changes that we've announced on September 25th.
I don't want to run out of time. I have one question actually for Ms. Reza. So our committee recently reviewed the Ombuds bait and switch report, and it raised some tough questions. So we've since heard that PSPC is changing how contracts are awarded, so moving from task-based system to more focused on corporate capacity. And that's a big shift, and people are very concerned. They're worried that what it means for fairness and outcomes. Would you be willing to return to committee so we can take a closer look at those changes together and make sure Canadians are getting real value for their money?
Sorry, I'll stop the clock, point of order.
Oh.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just wondering if we are straying off the topic of today's meeting being Canada Post.
We always allow very wide latitude, wide berth for questions, so I'm fine with it. We'll restart the clock. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for the invitation. As it happens, I'm coming back to committee next week, and I will be staying for an additional hour. So perhaps if that worked for the committee, and otherwise at your convenience, we'd be happy to come back and talk about some of the changes, why we're putting them in, and from a vendor performance management, how it's going to work with SMEs. Thank you.
And I'm coming back as well, so please feel free to send us your questions in advance, and we'll be well prepared.
Do I have time? Or?
Yeah, 55 seconds.
Okay, so real quick, just leadership means acting before a crisis, not after. And so after 10 years in and around the cabinet table, I guess we're wondering why should Canadians believe that suddenly today there's the political will to fix the problem that your government helped to create?
As I've mentioned, the reality has changed and the world has evolved, and I think the pandemic accelerated much of those changes that we're discussing today, whether it's the decline in letter mail volume, the digitalization of our lives, and I think that, warrants the changes that we've announced on September 25th. And I would also argue that, and thank William Kaplan for his report, which I think is a very thorough report and outlines the immediate steps that need to be taken to stabilize the financial situation at Canada Post. And I'm proud to be part of a government that's moving forward with these with the recommendations in the Kaplan report.
Thank you very much. Ms. Suds, please.
Oh, come on, no.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Minister, for being with us today, and obviously for the attention that this file, this issue with Canada Post has taken. You just mentioned, the pace of digital change in Canadians' lives. So I've heard you describe Canada Post as a vital national institution that is worth preserving. And when you put that in the context of the pace of digital change and an increasingly digital world, I'm wondering what role you view Canada Post having in that new world where digital is taking over.
Well, I think this will warrant, and Canada Post is owned by Canadians, and I think looking at the future of Canada Post, it's important that we review its mandate with an idea of what Canada Post will look like in 10, 15, 20 years. How can it, better adapt and offer services that make sense to Canadians as the world changes? And I'll be looking forward to hear from Canadians, hear from hopefully this committee at some point as well on what this can look like. But given the financial situation, given the losses in Q2, given the $10 million a day, and I hear now it's even more than that, to me it was important, and to the government it was important to move quickly, decisively, with the changes we've announced, to put the corporation on a sustainable financial footing, to give it the opportunity to right-size itself, transform itself, and to be efficient at what Canadians expect Canada Post to do, which is connecting Canadians from coast to coast to coast.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And I know we've talked a little bit about rural today, but I know even myself, I have the village of Carp as part of my riding of Canada. And there is questions as to what service will look like in rural parts of our country. And so can you share your thoughts or where you think service levels are going with respect to our rural communities?
Well, the directive I gave Canada Post was crystal clear as they, operate under this new paradigm where the rural moratorium that's been in place for 30 years, that hasn't changed in 30 years. So as they operate now without the constraint of this moratorium, I've made it crystal clear to the corporation that their obligation to serve Canadians and provide a good level of service comparable to what Canadians in urban areas get is paramount. And I'm looking forward to see how they intend to operationalize it. But as I've mentioned, the idea of lifting the moratorium is really because some of the communities, some of the post offices that are covered under the moratorium and have been covered for 30 years used to be rural but are now suburban, urban, and the list of examples is fairly lengthy across the country, and it makes for incongruencies where you would have communities where you have a post office and a point of service across the street in suburban Canada.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Certainly an important consideration, which you're obviously on top of. During your announcement in September, you indicated that reviewing the process for increases to the stamp rate to modernize and to shorten it in line with Commissioner Kaplan's recommendations was an important piece. So I'm curious the status of that review, if you have any update or any specific barriers that there are to a shorter stamp rate increase process.
I'll be happy to report that there are no barriers. We'll be moving forward with an expedited process that will allow Canada Post to increase the stamp rate. It's an important point because the time it takes to increase the stamp rate to better reflect the actual cost of delivering mail and the burdensome aspect of that process has made it so that the stamp rate in Canada has not kept pace with what other countries have done. If you look at international comparisons, we're way down compared to other countries in terms of the price of stamps in Canada. So I think giving that flexibility to Canada Post to move quickly and to alleviate. And as part of our red tape reduction process, that'll be included. So we're moving forward with that.
Thanks,
Okay.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
We'll go to Mrs. Block. Then we'll have one more intervention from the Liberals, and then we'll finish up with Madame Gaudreau for 2.5. Go ahead, Mrs. Block, for 5.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Minister, for joining us, as well as your departmental officials. In your opening remarks, and I've heard you repeat it a few times during your answers to my colleagues, you say that Canada Post is losing $10 million a day or more. Given that Canada Post has reported a $1.5 billion operating loss, which works out to about $4.1 million a day, where exactly are you getting the $10 million a day figure from?
So we've had extensive communications with Canada Post Chief Financial Officer, and this is on a daily basis currently. That's what they're losing. In fact, it's probably more at this point, and this is largely due to the labor unrest that we've seen in the last 20 months. Truth be told, because just if you look at when flyers and commercial mail is not sent, that impacts the bottom line. It's $1 billion in revenue for Canada Post. Okay. So all this taken together accounts for this very high number of 10 million. But I'm hearing it's way higher right now, though the 10 million has been duly verified. I can't speak to the numbers I've heard recently, so I won't go there. But I think it speaks to the importance for the union and management to reach a deal, negotiated deal, the sooner the better.
Thank you. You also mentioned the recent study that this committee undertook. And as you may be aware, while Conservatives agreed with the recommendations that were submitted in that report, we also submitted a supplementary report, specifically which noted the testimony of Canada Post CEO, who noted that the federal government failed to approve their strategic plan from 2019 to the date of his testimony. And so I'm wondering if you would advise us, what were the political reasons behind vetoing the independent strategic plan submitted by Canada Post over the last 5 years?
I can only speak for my tenure as minister. I've approved their latest corporate plan, and it's my intention that corporate plans be approved and submitted and available for review by parliamentarians on a yearly basis as we go forward, because I think it's important for Canadians to see how the transformation is going.
Right. Okay. Were you made aware that their plans had not been approved from 2019 to 2024?
Defer to the Deputy Minister on this one.
Yeah, I think that those corporate plans have been reviewed and looked at from the Treasury Board, who provides an annual overview of that. And I think some of the considerations were around how best to manage the fiscal situation and some of the issues that were faced with the labor unrest.
And do you think you did that? Do you think you did that, given where Canada Post is today, by not approving their strategic plan over the last 5 years? I'm just going to leave that question there. Minister, you've talked about Canada Post now in a process of right-sizing itself. How many additional jobs do you expect will be lost under this right-sizing, and over what timeline?
I think that's a question best asked to Canada Post, who's in charge of the operations. I'm not. However, I think even as the government is going through a comprehensive expenditure review where we're looking at efficiencies across government, I think it's only fair to expect the same thing from Canada Post, and even more so given that they're losing so much money. So I'm looking forward to see their plan. It's forthcoming. I think they have about 20 days left to bring that plan back. But on the specific numbers you're asking, it's best asked to the corporation in charge of the daily operations of Canada Post.
So at no time while you were preparing to make these announcements that happened on September 25th, you took into consideration the impact on the workforce that your announcements would have?
Well, that's not correct. Of course, it's something, when you look at the organization, Canada Post has a very big structure. that is designed to deliver volume that are not existent today. So I think it's only fair to ask the organization to right-size itself given the nature of letter mail today.
So you announce a plan and then tell them to right-size themselves without knowing exactly what the cost to the workforce might be.
Brief answer, please.
Well, on that note, I'm not in charge of the daily operations of Canada Post. Management is, so I think that's a question best asked for management. But when you have a Crown Corporation that's losing $10 million a day, I think it's only fair, and I'm sure you would agree, MP Block, to ask them to find the efficiencies and right-size themselves.
Thanks. Mr. Gasparo, please.
Yet.
So, in regards to right-sizing, the average household now receives 2 letters per week. Dramatic decrease from 5 years ago. And there's a degrading of demand for letter services to individual households. However, parcel delivery obviously is, there is significant demand. Some of the traditional media companies, for example, have picked up a lot of the deliveries from Amazon and other outlets. So can you talk a little bit about the strategy around parcel delivery and where how critical that is for Canada Post?
That's a good question. Thank you very much. And I think it's very important for Canada Post to find ways to be competitive. And I think it's highlighted in the Kaplan report that in order for Canada Post to be competitive, it needs to find ways to be more flexible, more agile, and a lot of this has to do with management and the union finding ways to work together much more efficiently than they've done in the past. I think the relationship between labor and management, I'm hoping for a renewal of that relationship given the financial circumstances, and that they'll both work together to, and I've met, me and my team have met extensively with the union. I've met with management as well, and I can tell that they both have, at heart, the future of Canada Post. They both want to find a viable path for the future of Canada Post, and I'm hoping that they'll find ways in their collective agreement to make it possible for Canada Post to find a financially viable future.
No further questions, Chair.
Madame Gaudreau, please, to finish off. Then we'll suspend quickly to allow our new witnesses to join us. Go ahead.
And
Madame.
we'll switch over to the Justice Committee.
I'm going to come back to parcels because I'm thinking about communities. I visited the Magdalen Islands, and following September 25th, people said I need prescriptions, and it's Canada Post that is responsible for the delivery, so regardless of where it is geographically. And these people are so worried. They're saying that there's so much competition. Canada Post will take care of letters, but they'll drop parcels. What reassures me is that we're talking about essential services, that you won't prevent the safety and security for so many letters and parcels, but at what price? How much are you prepared to put into this? How big a deficit, knowing that it's an essential service? Well, I'd say the least possible, because Canada Post's mission in the end is to offer the services that they offer in a financially viable manner. Now, reality dictates that it's been impossible the last few years for them to do so. That's why the government provided $1 billion and will give more. But the least possible, as far as I'm concerned, Canada Post has to find a way to operate, amongst others, by eliminating the constraints that they have. They need to be more efficient and to continue pursuing its essential mission. And thank you for raising the point. for Quebecers are very attached to Canada Post, as are all Canadians, and especially in the remote regions like the Magdalen Islands, as you mentioned. So, having said all that, people are aware that bailing out Canada Post year after year, and I think this answers Mr. Boulris, in part, this would come at a cost to other services that Canadians depend on. So I think that is how Canada Post really has a path that needs to follow, and this transformation is what we are asking of them. I have many questions, Mr. Chairman, but what now I can see is that there are many components. I know there are 20 days left, but in my opinion, the CEO absolutely has to come and speak to us about this request that's been put forward here. We're somewhat reassured, but we're still unsure about many elements, including this service. If I may, the conditions are clear. They have to maintain service to rural and remote communities. And given your interest and your defense of the regions, I'd really like to speak with you. I'd say in English. I don't have the French translation.
Et je veux m'assurer que ça soit le cas.
And I'll ensure that that's the case. That's what I hope. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Minister, thanks for joining us again. Colleagues will suspend for a couple moments to bring in our new witnesses.
Okay. We are going to switch over to the Justice Committee.
In both countries have a constitutional guarantee of free speech. In the United States, the government is not allowed constitutionally to limit speech, which here would be called hate speech. Hate speech is not a thing in the U.S. because the courts have said that is protected speech. And yet we've ended up in a situation here in the legislation that you're alluding to where the government is trying here and there and everywhere to try and limit how people talk.
Professor, what do you foresee as the worst case scenario of this bill should it pass? What is the slippery slope? Could we see people being arrested for edgy social media posts? Could we see political opponents? I have to bring up this hate speech thing. We have Liberal members of Parliament who have accused Jordan Peterson of hate speech, who have accused the recently assassinated Charlie Kirk of hate speech. Are they not, by making this accusation and then putting forward a bill like C9, essentially calling for their political opponents to be jailed?
Yes, well, potentially. Anyway, I mean, you wouldn't want to make that accusation without some concrete information, but essentially, yes, you could see happening in Canada the kind of thing that has been happening in the UK, where the police are sent out on missions to crack down on people saying, dangerous things online. I mean, that is not the situation you want in a country that claims to be free. You do not want a political role in determining what people can say. And the Jordan Peterson case is an excellent example.
Professor Alford, I have 30 seconds with you. You talked about the potential for this bill to violate the charter and be struck down. I did a documentary on free speech a couple years ago. There was a 5-4 decision that almost basically fined a comedian for telling a joke. How confident are you in the current makeup of Canada's Supreme Court to uphold free expression rights in Canada?
So the Ward decision that you alluded to would have completely changed the framework for the evaluation of reasonable limitations on freedom of speech. It was extremely troubling to see that it was considered a close question by a number of the justices. So I would really have strong fears that were this to come to the Supreme Court of Canada, that they would reevaluate that framework with the idea of balancing freedom of speech against some other compelling objective that would really be fundamentally dangerous to the democratic accountability and legitimacy of the government and indeed our constitutional state.
Thank you. Mr. Housefather, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to jump in and say a couple of things before I ask some questions. The first is that there's been a comment that there wasn't consultation. I know that there has been substantial consultation on this bill that have been done not only by the current minister, but by the previous Minister of Justice. And there have been discussions with faith communities across the country, including the Muslim community. I'm not saying that there is always not sufficient consultation, but there certainly has been consultation. I also have heard the argument about the United States. And of course, the United States, as I'm sure Professor Party would acknowledge, doesn't have Section 1 of their charter that limits freedom of speech in a way that, the right under Section 2 is limited in a way that it wouldn't be in the United States. And I think we would agree on that. I'd also note a comment from some of the Conservatives. I think it's important to remember that this committee last December issued a report in which we recommended the significant majority of the things that are in this bill, and the Conservative Party issued a limited dissent, which didn't dissent on any of these points. So I just want to put things into context. Professor Party, you mentioned that people should be allowed to hate and allowed to say that you do hate. And in a way, as long as they don't encourage violence, I guess people can hate. As long as they don't incite, I guess they're allowed to say that they hate. I don't disagree with you. We can morally say that's wrong. For example, one of the things that you once said, Canadians have been sold a bill of goods. Many of them think that they have a right to equal treatment under the law. They think that discrimination is illegal, but nothing could be further from the truth. In Canada, discrimination is lawful as long as it is committed against the right groups, and in particular against straight white men. I think we can both agree that many people might disagree with what you just said there, but I don't know that you would argue that this bill would allow anyone to decide that that would be hate speech, would you? You wouldn't imply that this bill is going so far as to criminalize that type of speech, are you?
I'm sorry, to criminalize what kind of speech?
The speech like you just made, the speech where you declared that, for example, straight white men were the ones that were discriminated against in Canada. That you're not arguing that this type of law would stop you from saying that, are you?
I don't think I would go quite that far. What you're reading from is a legal analysis. So if we get to a place in this country where doing a legal analysis is criminal, then we're in really bad shape. But I wouldn't have jumped to there. No.
Okay. So Professor Alford, can I ask you a question? You had talked, and rightly so, about there's always a balance, right? I agree. The Charter Statement should make clear that this is a clear violation of Section 2. There is no doubt. And the question is whether it's saved under Section 1. And there are restrictions on freedom of speech that can be saved under Section 1, as Keekstra said, as other cases have said. And there must be a limit where, for example, my right to freedom of speech blocks someone else from exercising their right to freedom of speech. For example, if I intimidate or obstruct someone from entering into their place of worship, so they have no longer a right to practice their religion freely, we can't say for sure how a court will rule, but it is a legitimate decision of the legislator to determine that that would be consistent with a Section 1 limitation of Section 2 rights. Would you not agree, Professor Alford?
I do agree. And I would say the reason why I agree is because there we're talking about what are frequently labeled time, place, and manner restrictions that don't talk about the content of the speech. So therefore, it's far more likely to say it's a legitimate restriction because we're not making this discrimination on the kind of speech which is involved. But I think that what you're pointing to is the kind of thing that we should be crafting rather than talking about particular types of speech or the intentions behind speech.
Totally understood, and I appreciate that discussion. I take note of your point under 319 and the definition. Ms. Alazim, I'm going to ask you a completely different type of question, but can I just give you the opportunity, because I don't think you understood the translation of what Mr. Fortin said in French, and I just want to give you the context in English so that you could perhaps answer and put yourself on the record as you want. Maybe you just want to leave what you said, but I'm not sure you would because I'm not sure you understood exactly the translation. What Mr. Fortin was asking, he and the Bloc Québécois have a private member's bill that they have proposed to remove the religious exemption on hate speech. For example, if I make a speech and I can claim that in my good faith my religion led me to this speech that would otherwise be hate speech, then it's okay. So Mr. Fortin was asking you whether you agreed with him that that religious-based exemption should be removed from the bill, which is what he's proposing. That's what he was asking.
Thank you, Mr. Housefather. I appreciate your opportunity to give me an opportunity to clarify. I appreciate the question. There's a few things I want to clarify. So I'll start with clarifying.
Be extremely quick in your response.
For the record, that NCCM has condemned the October 7th attacks. Just to be clear, has condemned the October 7th attacks by Hamas and likewise condemned all violations really of international law. But I just also want to note that nobody else was asked these lines of questions on this panel, and it again belies that there's real concerns with this type of legislation. And I'm tired, frankly, of our communities being asked this 2.5 years into genocide, that there's always this proximity to terror and hate that's constantly associated to the Muslim community.
Ms. Alazam?
So I just did want to clarify that.
We're way over time. Any clarification you can gladly submit in writing, or someone else on the team can follow up in the next round of questions. Thank you.
I would also just note I didn't ask those questions.
Thank you, Mr.
I only asked you to clarify.
Thanks.
Thank you. If we keep this next round tight, we'll get through everyone. Otherwise, it'll cut into Mr. Babber's or Ms. Dillon's time. So let's get going. We're starting off with Mr. Lawton, then Latanzio, Fortin, Babber, and then Dillon. So over to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much. Madame Bussière, I'd like to ask you about C9's approach to hate symbols. Now, you would agree that under the current law, someone who displays a hate symbol, and I'm using broadly the definition, let's say, that C9 uses, could be charged under Section 319 right now, correct?
Effectivement, il y a différentes dispositions du Code criminel qui peuvent être utilisées.
Yes, various provisions of the criminal code could be used when symbols are used. All will depend on the context. One of our questions concerning the provision is to look whether we are already repeating something that already exists in the criminal code.
Believe that as worded now, Bill C9 would make the display of a symbol on its own a criminal offense, or do you believe that it is just part of the context that could lead to a hate charge?
C'est intéressant parce qu'il y a une tension par rapport à ça dans la manière.
It's interesting. The way we read the text may be different from the way the minister has presented it. He said it's not complete prohibition of any display of a symbol. But when we read the text, it's not very clear. We seem to associate the fact that there's a desire to incite hatred and the fact of displaying a terrorist or a symbol of terrorism or hatred. But there are already criminal consequences if symbols of terrorism are displayed or symbols of hate, but all will depend on the context.
You shared that, Madame Bussière, because this is as with the hate definition, another example then of where the minister's description of the law actually differs from the law itself.
Ben, il y a certainement une tension. Après ça, à partir du moment où...
There is some tension, but the courts will have to interpret it, and they will refer to the text, to the context, to the objective of the legislation and the intention of the legislator, what was said and what was presented. So I cannot give you a final answer to the question, but when you read the text, it raises some questions.
Professor Pardee, I'd like to return to you on this. Are you aware that the Ontario Human Rights Commission views misgendering someone, identifying them as the wrong gender, to be discrimination and to be against the law of the Ontario Human Rights Code?
Yes.
So when we saw Bill C-16 in a previous parliament, this was the bill that led Jordan Peterson to speak out so vocally on this. This was expanding Canadian human rights law to include gender identity and effectively embedding in Canadian human rights law the very similar provisions that we have in various provincial human rights codes, correct?
Correct.
So I realize the Canadian Human Rights Act does not itself tie to the criminal code, but it does give a sense of where the government wants to go with this, especially looking at Bill C-63, the Online Harms Act from the previous parliament. And do you see misgendering as being something that could attract a hate charge, the way that this government has viewed hate and the way that C-9 is worded?
Certainly. Potentially. Sure. There's no reason to think not.
And that is, to go back to the UK case, precisely what a lot of people are finding themselves receiving the knock on the door from a British constable over. It's them tweeting something that has waged into gender. Now, again, I do not take, in the purpose of our discussion on C9, the view that this committee needs to weigh in on this, but it is a live issue that people should be able to freely debate. So when the state is deciding what constitutes hate, my question is, what are the implications on limiting the ability to hash out controversial subjects in society?
Well, they could be devastating. Yes. So there's back when C-16 was being debated, I was a witness at one of the Senate committee meetings. And one of the senators in that meeting said to me, well, look, I'm a free speech guy, but, this requiring people to use proper pronouns is just reasonable speech. It's reasonable speech, and therefore it's reasonable legislation. And that completely misconceives the whole idea. The job of the government is not to legislate reasonable speech. If you had a statute that said Canadians will be required to say hello and please and thank you, because that's reasonable speech, that is totalitarian, because speech is something that people decide for themselves. And so as long as the government thinks that its role is to make sure that people are speaking reasonably, then you're totally off on the wrong track. People's speech is their own unless, for my money, unless they are threatening violence. And if you're over that threshold, you're going to get into the potential for the kinds of problems that you are alluding to. And that potential is very, very real.
Okay. Well, appropriately, thank you. I'll go on to Ms. Latanzio now.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question will be for Ms. Alazem. Ms. Alazem, in recent media articles, Stephen Brown, the Chief Executive Officer of the National Council of Canadian Muslims, said being generally supportive of Bill C-9, noting that his organization has lingering concerns, and I'm quoting, over how the law will be applied and whether law enforcement will properly distinguish between what does and does not count as hate symbol. Can you explain to us what is the scope of hate crime affecting the Muslim community in Canada, and to what extent is it linked to Islamophobia?
Oh, it's certainly linked, and the scope is such that I didn't even know about that public statement, because every day I'm busy kind of dealing with the calls that we get day in and day out of Muslims across this country who have suffered from a variety of hate crimes, including just this week, to assaults, again, a woman brutally beat on the streets of Toronto. So certainly we see, I think that's what your question was getting at, we see hate crimes of that are unfortunately only gaining in numbers, and they don't seem to be letting up, and in all facets of life. And really, it's as Muslims are just participating in public life, walking down the street, accessing a grocery store, driving out of a parking lot.
How is it, like, if you could explain to us how it is directly linked to Islamophobia?
How those hate crimes are directly linked to Islamophobia? Yes. Well, certainly it is. Well, certainly the crimes, I could draw you some direct links of, if somebody's punching you and saying something very, very viscerally anti-Muslim, right, then that's very clear that this culture and climate of Islamophobia enables and emboldens people to be able to behave in that way.
With the legal department, can you give us an idea of how many incidents you've received of this type of hate crime or Islamophobia over the last couple of months, or perhaps the last year?
I think we've received well over 700 in the last year. We do a report annually to, I just don't have the numbers, sorry, off the top of my head. That's something I do go and revisit it annually, but I just don't have it off the top of my head. But I can tell you, I get at least one call a day of these types of incidences.
Opening remarks, you spoke about wanting to be consulted. Were you not aware that, all communities, including the Muslim community, were consulted over the course of the summer with regards to the issue of Bill C-9? Were you not, or maybe your organization, consulted? I just want to be clear on that.
Yeah, to clarify, no, I appreciate the opportunity. To clarify, I said consulted about the full contents. While we were consulted, and we've had many consultations with governments about, for example, the freestanding hate provisions for many years. The parts, for example, about Section 2.2, for example, that's something that was completely a surprise. There's lots of elements of the bill, and that's why I said the full contents of the bill, because it would have been nice, I think, to have proper consultation with all the communities that are impacted, not just by the bill, but that the bill purports to protect.
Parts of the bill were you consulted on during the course of the summer?
I believe it was the freestanding hate crime provision and perhaps the obstruction offense. To be honest, I wasn't personally consulted, so I'd have to go back and check. It wasn't me that was in those consultations.
Okay, but you do recognize that the Muslim community was consulted?
On certain elements of it, right? Okay. But the elements that we weren't are the elements that we take a severe problem with, right? That we have severe concerns.
Which
that we're
is your
raising.
section 2.2.
Exactly.
Okay. And can you share with the committee how Bill C9, if passed, would affect the Canadian Muslim community?
Sure. I mean, I can give you the example of the Shia procession that I was trying to describe earlier, of Shia Muslims who participate in the Arba'in procession and walk with a green headband. And that happened just last year, and a bunch of bigots took to the internet taking photos of young children who were participating in that procession. Again, it's not a political rally. There's no political speech involved. It's
Oh my
purely
God, I can't
a religious observance. And a number of bigots took to the internet posting photos of those children and saying that they are, young Hamas or they're being trained or engaging in some kind of terrorist activity.
Thank you, Ms. Alzheimer.
And this is where I get
cut her off.
No problem.
Monsieur Fortin, 2 minutes.
Oh, thank God.
Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Professor Parry, I'll ask you the same question I've asked many times. I believe you heard it concerning the quote stated by Adil Shakawi in October 2024 in Montreal. If you want, I'll reread it. I would like to know whether, in your opinion, that statement is allowed in Canada. You may say it's not adequate, but I would like to find out if that statement, in your opinion, is permitted. Secondly, the section of the Criminal Code, Section 319, the paragraph that provides for a valid defense based on religious exemption when we make a hate speech. Should that be withdrawn from the Criminal Code? 1, is it legal, what Shakawi said? 2, should we remove the religious exemption defense?
Right. Okay, well, let me address the second question first because it's more straightforward. Those defenses that you're referring to in Section 319 are defenses to hate speech. And I don't think hate speech should be a crime. So yes, those
agree.
defenses should remain. Because when you're talking about, let's just be clear, when we're talking about hate speech, we are not talking about an assault. That is a threat of violence. If it was a threat of violence, it could be prosecuted as an assault. So when we're talking about hate speech that does not include a threat of violence, then it's something else. And in my books, that speech should not be restricted. So the answer to your...
Il nous reste quelques secondes. Je m'excuse. Je sais que...
Thank you. I know I'm not being polite. I have a few minutes left. 2 minutes have gone by already. I understand that, in your opinion, if I say that we need to exterminate all political, liberal and conservative political organizers because I lost my election, that could be acceptable even if I'm asking them to be killed.
No, that's not true. So there's going to be a problem here where speech is not just hate speech, it's actually a threat. And what you're describing there is potentially a threat to the lives of other people.
Quand je dis, alors charge-toi des ennemis du peuple.
When I read out, deal with the enemies of the people, count them and exterminate them, don't you think that's a threat of violence?
Potentially.
No, that's it.
Yes.
Mr. Party, thank you.
To be honest, I would like to see
Mr. Party, thank you.
For myself. But
Mr.
yes,
Baber, it's over to you.
Potentially, yeah.
No,
Sir, what's the problem with my question? You don't like it?
No, I think your question is totally fine. I think you've asked it 8 times. Mr. Baber, over to you.
What the hell is going on?
Mr. Party, I'll permit you to answer for my friend's benefit. The call in Montreal was for extermination of the Zionists, or supposedly a prayer for extermination of the Zionists. Do you believe that that is protected speech?
No, I in the abstract, if you say to me, if you call for the death of people, whether it's particular people or a group of people, that in my books is not okay. So I don't think you should be able to hide behind the context of that advocacy. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Professor Party, I'd like to talk about a few elements of the bill that haven't spoken, that have yet to be addressed today.
Yes.
The new criminal hate offense can be laid in response to any offense contrary to any act of Parliament. Is that correct?
Right. Sounds like it, yep.
Yeah, so in other words, you can predicate the standalone criminal hate offense on conduct that is not necessarily criminal.
Sure, that's correct. That's possible. Yep.
So, for instance, you could suggest that non-payment of wages under the Canada Labour Code, if it is motivated by hate, could lead to a criminal charge.
Correct.
You could suggest that if someone's engaged in the suppression of votes under the Canada Elections Act, that could lead to a criminal charge.
Yes.
I find that very, very concerning.
So do I.
Especially given that the government appears to, well, in fact, seeks to lower the bar to convict of hate, and at the same time as removing the safeguard of the Attorney General. Would you recommend that we confine the application of the standalone hate offense to offenses that are truly criminal in nature?
Well, first, yes, absolutely. But second, I would recommend that you get rid of it altogether. And that's because what you are now doing, even if you limit it to criminal offenses, you are setting up two tiers of violent offenses. So let's compare two things. Let's say somebody assaults two different people, and one of them, they just choose somebody randomly on the street, or they pick somebody that they know. And in the second case, they pick somebody because of their identity. And in both cases, they do exactly the same thing. They beat them up. Okay? Both of those things are wrong. They're both offenses, and they're both equal because the amount of violence is equal. And what we're doing now is saying, well, one of those is more serious than the other one. No, they're both serious, they're both violent, they're both wrong.
If a person intimidates someone while obstructing them from entry into a religious institution or an educational institution, isn't that already illegal? Isn't that already criminal?
Yes, it is criminal if there's any kind of intimidation or violence involved, in the sense that we have criminal code offenses that can be applied there. And if those offenses do not apply because the elements are not there, then all you're talking about probably is speech, and speech should be fine.
I would think that if you're intimidating someone while obstructing them from entering a premise, that would be assault.
You'd think so. Yes, if you have absolute obstruction, if you are standing in the way and you're moving around to make sure that they can't get around you and yelling in their face, then that sounds like a criminal code offense that we already have. Yes.
Professor Party, I look at this bill overall. The government is lowering the bar for what hate speech is. It's removing the safeguard of the Attorney General consent, potentially opening folks to politically motivated prosecutions. You can lay the new hate charge on top of what is essentially civil conduct. I don't understand why this Liberal government is so obsessed with criminalizing freedom of expression.
I don't either. I wish I knew.
Thank you, Mr. Party.
You good? You have another? You good?
Yeah.
Okay. Ms. Dillon for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll direct my question to Ms. Al-Azam.
Of course you will. Of course.
You mentioned being perturbed by a certain line of questioning today, and you were cut off. Would you like to elaborate a little bit on that?
Certainly, I find it really concerning that the Muslim woman in the room was the one who was consistently asked to condemn Hamas and talk about terrorist actions, et cetera, et cetera. I think this proximity, this like constant association of Muslims to being proximate to terror, is part and parcel of exactly the kind of thing that I mentioned in our initial submissions, which is that we've seen for 2 decades exactly as how that line of thinking and that kind of viewing of Muslim Canadians has really impacted our not just sense of citizenship, but that we end up being over-policed and under-protected. So I really appreciate your opportunity to let me finalize that thought.
And that's. Thank you for sharing that. And you've mentioned that there's an increase in the last year in attacks, and every single day you get a certain phone call from somebody being attacked one way or the other because of their identity. Could you please talk to us a little bit the difference about what you've seen between the acts being denounced when you're being called versus what you've seen in the past?
Sorry, I don't think I fully understood the question.
So when my colleague, Ms. Latanzio, was asking you about every day you're getting a phone call, you mentioned during your testimony, of somebody being attacked on the base of their race, the way they look. Can you talk to us a little bit about the difference? Has there been a big increase in the last years that you've seen in violent acts committed against people in your community? And what kind of difference between previous attacks and these ones have you seen?
I would definitely say that there is certainly an increase. It's been an overwhelming increase for our organization to be able to address. In terms of the nature or the violence of those acts, no, unfortunately, it's not worse because we saw in in the Quebec mosque shooting, and that was how many years ago. We saw the our London family terror attack, and that was how many years ago. We saw what happened in mosques in Toronto, a caretaker at a mosque in Toronto being killed, and that was many years ago. So I can't say that they've increased in intensity, because I don't think you can increase in intensity when you're already starting line is murder. But in terms of the frequency, I'm certainly seeing an increase in frequency and an increase in regular assaults as people are just going about their days totally unprovoked, and alongside it, Islamophobic remarks or comments, etc. It certainly adds to this general phenomenon of feeling over-policed and underprotected, certainly.
And it was just mentioned before that beating up somebody is beating up somebody, and they merit, the same prosecution. That if somebody's being beaten up because they are, and somebody on the basis of the way they look, what do you have to say about that?
Certainly, the underlying maybe action is the same, but in terms of the impact that may have on a community, as a community organization that delivers community impact statements regularly in criminal sentencing matters, I can definitely assure the members of this committee that it does have real impacts. And I was I'm a Londoner. I was in the room when the Nathaniel Veltman was sentenced. I was in the room when his actions were declared terrorism. And I was in the room a full gallery of Londoners who still are still dealing with the impacts of those actions and how it ends up impacting their sense of belonging. And it's not just Muslims. It impacts a number. We heard from a number of vulnerable community members and community groups how it impacted their sense of belonging.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Dillon. Thank you, Ms. Alazem. And thank you for the witnesses on this first panel. We will suspend for a couple minutes, switch over. Thank you for taking the time to do this.
Okay. Wait, is that Brock? Did I just see Brock sitting there? No, that was the Bloc MP. Okay. Okay, we're going to call it here. I don't really want to watch the rest of this committee. Pretty much the first hour is what I wanted to see anyway. I wanted to see Lightbound. But yeah, I've got a couple clips that I'm going to put out on the channel, not from question period, but specifically from Sean Fraser, and like he held a press conference today, and then also sort of Pierre Poilievre. I already put one out from yesterday if you guys didn't see it, but I'm sure you guys saw it on like X or something where what's it called? Pierre was asked by a reporter about his RCMP comments and Trudeau comments. He replied to that. That's in the video section. But anything up at the top of the page where you see the Stay Informed playlist is where I'm going to put some of the press conferences that happened from earlier today. So, yeah, that's it. Obviously, you guys know we're not live tomorrow. I will be live on Monday. So Monday should be a pretty busy day. There's a couple committees going on and question period. And, yeah, I will put some clips out on the weekend. Maybe, we'll see, but definitely we'll be back Monday. So thanks for the birthday wishes, everybody. And thank you so much for tuning in and watching. And I hope you all have a fantastic rest of your evening and fantastic rest of your day. Rest of the weekend, whatever. You get what I mean? Okay, see you guys. Cheers. Bye-bye.